Well, for more on the upcoming trade talks between the world's largest economies, I'm joined by Dan McClory, live from Irvine, California. He's the Managing Director and Head of China for Boustead Securities. Welcome back, Dan.
Thank you, Rachelle.
So what are the expectations from both sides going into this meeting?
Well, certainly they would like to compartmentalize and deal with the trade issues and this looming cessation of the trade truce, if that's what it becomes, and not the whole Huawei overshadow. So Mnuchin has said that they're going to be able to separate and segregate. This is, has to do with the Department of the Treasury, and this has to do with the Department of Justice. These are two separate matters. But I think they need to remain very, very focused on the job at hand, which is to ensure that a trade deal is put together and that these more punitive tariffs aren't enforced in March.
Now, obviously, we mentioned this merging of the issues, and we know that the U.S. Department of Justice handed down several indictments against Huawei and its CFO as these talks are set to begin. But when Meng was arrested, President Trump weighed in, saying he was willing to intervene in her case if it helped secure, quote, the largest trade deal ever made. How much does the Huawei issue complicate the trade talks?
It's a definite complication. But something that has occurred over the last 6 or 7 months is the fact that the China trade wars, the Huawei situation, it is not Trump administration specific. There's a much wider and a much broader group that's out there that I would even, venture to guess that if you took President Trump out of the equation tomorrow for whatever reason, there might be, as strong or even stronger outcry about Chinese containment or whatever these buzzwords are in Washington nowadays. So I think President Trump will ultimately be pragmatic and within the proper legal guidelines as well as the right negotiating guidelines will work to resolve both situations. But for the time being, they remain separate and they're being focused on differently and independently.
And as we focus on the trade talks, we know that the key sticking points for the U.S., like forced technology transfer accusations, obviously, and access to the Chinese market. How far apart are the two sides in managing these differences?
They're pretty far apart, but it's not just because from a philosophical or a business point of view they're far apart. These are difficult topics to be able to manage and handle. And again, I link it back to Huawei. It's sort of like you have to prove a couple of negatives. That these chips, that they don't have certain capabilities that could be proactively used against certain governments or countries. And at the same time, then they have to prove that they won't be used in the future again. Well, how the heck are you going to do that? I mean, these are things that are somewhat very difficult. You can identify the issue and say we have a problem with this, but how do you actually implement it and enforce it? What do you do? In any country. I'm not just talking about China or the U.S. In any country, you're going to have this challenge. So the execution of it is really challenging.
And it certainly doesn't help that they have the end of this 90-day trade truce coming up. So how much is at stake for both economies in trying to secure something before that deadline?
Well, again, bringing the two issues together that are facing both countries right now, I mean, there's already been interruption and adjustment to the global supply chain in anticipation of the tariffs going one way or another, and now as a result of Huawei. And we've seen it with, the stock exchange values of companies that are in that supply chain, the chip manufacturers like Broadcom and Qualcomm and Intel, all have taken hits. So they're very much related. It's very much complicated, the issue. But I do believe Steven Mnuchin and his team, they are going to sit down and focus on these issues. You can't ignore what else is playing out in the background, but they're going to focus on these issues. Because if they can come to some resolution on these issues, I think it's really going to give a more positive outlook to what's occurring, from the Justice Department in another area. And Rachelle, one thing I would mention is, this sort of treatment by the Justice Department occurs, I'll say, to domestic as well as foreign counterparties. It really does. This is just their style, to come at you full force and make all kinds of allegations and air it publicly. So I don't think Huawei and China per se are being singled out with some unusual kind of presumed guilty treatment. This is Justice's style, and that's just the way they go about things, regardless of where you come from.
Now, Dan, we also have a couple of other things going on in the background. We have China's economic slowdown. You also have the WTO recently launching its investigation into Trump's tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese goods. How do you expect that to weigh on negotiations as the talks continue?
Well, one important thing is, as much as President Trump and the administration have sort of become nationalistic and withdrawn from those global organizations, China has become much more internationalized and much more embracing of these forums to be utilized for their intended purpose. So I think you're going to see, level-handed and fair treatment from these global institutions, because right now China is kind of holding that standard and saying, we advocate for these institutions. I think some critics would say internationally China does, but domestically they still have some things that they have to adjust. So I think China should come out good in the court of international opinion and discussions and rulings, and maybe because of this current environment where the Trump administration is seeing as sort of deprioritizing those institutions.
All right, thank you so much, Dan McClory there, Managing Director and Head of China for Boustead Securities.